You could just let me go,
Conrad moaned, as the rough rope around his wrists pulled and dragged him forward into another almost fall. The man leading him, well, sitting on the horse his restraints were connected to, didn't even bother to turn and look back. He was rough, grimy, and covered in dust, but at least for now, he hadn't beaten him up or lost his temper. Which was a marked improvement, Conrad thought with a wry smile, and started to walk quicker for a few steps, to give himself and his wrists a couple of moments to relax.
Oh, at least you could cut the rope. It's not like I can run away from you anyway. I wouldn't chafe so much, and you wouldn't have to listen to my whining.
Finally, the man's head turned back, and what Conrad saw up there in the face gave him a bit of hope. A slight smile as he shook his head. So he was human, after all. Conrad took another step and then stumbled as the sole of his right boot got snagged on a small rock and finally tore free from the rest of the shoe. With a pitiful cry, he fell onto the dry and dusty ground and also scraped his elbows in the process. The man on the horse chuckled, then pulled at the rope, and Conrad felt a stinging pain as it cut into his wrists again and dragged him forward. He had to pull in his knees and let them scrape over the earth to get up on his feet quickly before he could be sent sprawling once more.
Really?
He asked incredulously, but the man on the horse just gave him a wink. On second thought, no. The man was no improvement over the rest. This wasn't the first time he had found himself in such a predicament, and by God, he was pretty sure it wouldn't be the last time either. Such was life, his mama used to say. You get your lot and you live by it, and if you're lucky, you'll grow old surrounded by family. What a fucking joke. He had never wanted to live such a life, not even as a kid. That's why he had come here, so close to the frontier. People had told him that there was freedom to be found in this place, opportunities galore, that every man could take their life into their own hands and forge their own destiny. What an absolute bunch of bullshit. The land here was no more rich in chances than any other. There was only one marked difference, he had found, and that was the amount of danger. Back where he had grown up, you could get robbed or maybe beaten up by a drunkard if you were unlucky and dumb enough to walk past a tavern at the wrong time. Sometimes people had disappeared, but most of those cases had very good reasons behind them. Gambling debt, sickness, and the like. But out here, oh boy. You had people targeting others. If someone didn't like the way you dressed or, God forbid, your face, you could find yourself at the wrong end of a gun pretty quickly. Conrad had seen oral arguments turn deadly in a matter of seconds, and normal brawls end bloody and brutally far too often. There was no freedom to be found in this place, no great opportunities anyone could grab a hold of. The only thing that existed out here was danger and madness. A sudden jerk going through the rope and into his wrists made him stumble again. And for once, the smile disappeared from Conrad's lips. He had come here to this place 4 years ago, and they had been the worst of his existence. At first, He had tried to live a normal life, like his mother would have wanted. He had looked for honest work and had soon found it. Dragging around lumber, helping out with constructions, stuff like that. Only, as he soon had to realize, even the normal-seeming people here were completely fucked up beneath the surface. The guy that had hired him shorted him every chance he got. It felt like every single day he tried to talk to him, and all he ever got were excuses and promises. Until one day, the man drank and gambled away all the money they would have gotten for a storefront, which in turn led to him being beaten and lynched by the rest of the crew. Conrad had stayed away from the commotion, even though he had known it was happening. He didn't want to be a part of it, yet on the other hand, couldn't be seen to be helping his former boss. From then on, every time he came across one of the guys from the crew, they just nodded at each other. A silent promise to not dredge up the past. Soon after, he had joined a merchant, and they left him stranded in a town he had never been in. 2 months later, he helped a farmer with the animals, but got the boot after someone managed to steal 2 horses. Every time he had found a place to stay, his life had turned to shit. That was until he had joined an expedition, as that limey fuck had called it. Conrad had never seen a man that boisterous and arrogant, yet so useless in his whole life. A guy so self-assured but completely reliant on other people. He had waltzed into town boasting about his expedition, and Conrad had joined up. His logic had been sound. At least so he had thought. The guy was more interested in fame than money, which meant he wouldn't mind paying up at the end of the day. All in all, 12 people volunteered, some as guards, others as porters. Conrad had fallen into the latter category. Loading and unloading the horses, putting up the tents and caring for the animals and other people. It wasn't the most glamorous work, but it had paid well enough and had finally given him a reason to leave that damn town behind. The group, which was made up of 15 people, set off on a Sunday morning, and it took them 3 weeks to make it to the spot the pompous fuck had chosen. An old holy place of a long since vanished tribe. He had claimed. All Conrad had seen were the same rocks and shrubs one could find everywhere around here. But he had kept his mouth shut and his head down. Getting kicked out of the party at that point would have spelled his doom. He remembered the first night, camping at that place. The sullen face of the fat guy, slowly realizing that the map he had bought might have been a fake. Conrad and the rest of the porters had shot each other glances all throughout the evening and had stopped everyone from drinking any alcohol, for fear of one of them saying something dumb. Already past midnight, the fat fuck had ordered all the porters to get shovels and start digging then and there. What a joke, Conrad had thought, but had followed the others out to the rock formation close to their camp. Well, something else he had learned throughout the 4 years had come true then again. No situation is shitty enough to not get worse in some way. It had taken them half an hour, digging in the almost dark, only illuminated by a few torches, before the first one of them had cried out. It had been a young guy, one Conrad had talked to a few times, who had found something. There had been a commotion. Some jumped in and helped the young porter, while others went to wake up the fat fuck. No one here had honestly thought they would find anything. But Conrad had felt it back then. Ice-cold fingers stroking the nape of his neck. The hand of death, touching all of them one by one. He had jumped back and onto the rocky outcrop to catch a glimpse of what they had found, just as the fat man and his 2 bodyguards appeared from the tents. In the flickering light of the torches, Conrad had seen it. A skull, old and weathered, with a broken forehead where the shovel had struck it, was passed around down there. That was when the screaming started. The young porter was the first to cry out. Then the ones next to him. One by one they howled. And suddenly, the whole camp was thrown into chaos. Conrad hadn't been able to understand what was happening at first. From his spot, all he could see were the people racing around, the bodyguards drawing their weapons and firing into the ground. And then the torches extinguishing. The men were shouting and screaming for their lives, running down there in the darkness, while Conrad ducked and hid among the rocks. Something must have attacked them, he thought. Wild animals or the like. But he didn't dare to look out from his hiding spot. The night seemed far darker than normal, and shouts were still ringing out. Yet, all he noticed in that commotion was the sound of sand and loose dirt shuffling close by, as someone touched the rock he was hiding on. Conrad felt a chill as he remembered. Then another tug at the rope, and almost stumbled again, while the bare sole of his foot stepped onto a sharp rock.
Calm down there,
he groaned. But the man on the horse was still leading him along the vast and open prairie. Now, with only one shoe working as intended, this trip would soon get truly torturous, he knew. Every few seconds it seemed as if he stepped onto something sharp, and it was only a matter of time before his foot would start bleeding.
You know, we've been going for hours. How about a break?
The man gave no answer, and Conrad sped up a bit to get some slag into the rope. He could see the bounty hunter immediately putting a hand on his gun. A clear sign to keep back, away from him.
Come on. You're gonna lose a lot of money if I don't make it, right?
Conrad heard a growl and kept at that distance, 4 steps behind the horse. Too far away to lunge for the man. There was no point in provoking him any further.
The sun will set in a few hours, and you're not gonna make me walk through the night, right?
A chill ran down his spine as he thought about his words. If the man truly wanted to do that, this trip would find an abrupt end. The man, for his part, only growled again.
We'll reach the city by tomorrow. It doesn't matter if we rest now or continue walking.
Conrad could see the man looking at him out of the corner of his eye. He knew people like that very well. Even if they liked an idea, as long as they didn't see it as theirs, they would always balk. But sometimes, in very special circumstances, they could actually be reasoned with.
Look, man, even your horse wants to take a break. poor thing will soon start dragging its hind leg if we keep going like this.
That earned him a direct glance at the man, and Conrad did his best to look as innocent as possible while pointing at the animal's rear right hoof.
You really don't want that to get any worse. I can tell you. I worked with horses for a bit.
The gruff man scoffed and tugged at the brim of his hat. But from then on, every few minutes, Conrad could see him looking back and softly stroking the side of his horse. It was obvious, he thought. They would rest soon and probably right on time, since he could feel the pain in his foot growing worse by the second, while the sun was slowly making its way down toward the horizon. Only Conrad couldn't really be happy about it. The man now increased the tempo steadily, which meant he had to almost start jogging to not get dragged behind the horse. He wasn't sure if that was to punish him for his words from before, or if the guy just wanted to make sure they wouldn't lose too much by stopping their journey earlier than expected. His foot hurt more and more the longer this went on. The first drops of blood were already seeping into the dried-out ground behind him, while the horse in front was trampling down parts of cacti. Conrad grimaced as one of the spikes found his skin and hopped on one foot for a few moments to pull it out, just in time before the rope almost ripped him from his feet. No, falling down now would hurt even more. He needed to stay upright, whatever the cost. Groaning, he fell into a light jog and could see the man on the horse shooting him another hidden glance. His hand was still on the revolver.
I'll enjoy tonight, especially for you,
he thought, while forcing himself to grin through the pain. Maybe the guy wanted to tire him out right now, before night fell. Conrad shook his head. It didn't matter anymore why he did it, only how long it would go on. Could he stay on his feet until the end? He let his mind wander to block out the pain. That one night that had changed his life, when he was hiding on the rocky outcrop, he forced himself to think about that instead of the rough ground beneath his wounded and bloody foot. It had been so dark after the torches had gone out that he could hardly see his own hand in front of his face. The people around him had screamed and stopped, one by one. Even those back in the camp had made a ruckus. Gunshots went off in the night, followed by more crying. He remembered being so confused. If that was an animal attack, he had thought, he would have heard the thing howling in pain. But there was no non-human noise. Nothing had growled or barked. All in all, it was over after not even 5 minutes. The last scream echoed across the plains before silence fell upon the land. Well, not total silence. Conrad remembered huddling with his back against a rock, trying to stay as still as possible, while the breeze that blew past him brought with it a rotten smell. The noise of something shuffling through the sand and loose dirt was now constant and started to ring in his ears. He had clung to his legs and closed his eyes, wishing himself far away from the place, but nothing had happened. It had been like all the people had simply disappeared. Conrad didn't know how long he had sat there, only that after a time, when his eyes had grown accustomed to the darkness, he had slowly looked around and had found that he really was completely alone. There was no trace from anyone besides the shovels now lying strewn across the place. Even the tents were still there. Some had lost a few struts, others were completely fine, but there was no movement, no sound happening there either. On hands and knees, he crawled out of his hiding spot and listened. This scraping, shuffling noise was the only thing he could still hear. It was coming right from the edge of the rocky outcrop he had been on all this time. Slowly, Conrad had crawled over there to find out what it was and had seen. A gunshot ripped him from his thoughts, and as he stared up at the rider, he could see him sitting there with his revolver drawn, taking aim again. The gruff man was cursing loudly, gave off a second shot, and Conrad looked in the direction he was shooting in. Something that seemed like a shadow whizzed by, fell into a sprint, and ran off. Its fur was shimmering in the light. Conrad breathed a sigh of relief as he spotted it, but the man on the horse looked less happy.
They won't come near again. Those things are cowards.
He tried to lift his captor's spirits, but the man shot him an angry glance.
Shooting at them is just wasting bullets. They only feed on dead things anyway.
The words earned him a growl, then a tug at the rope, and Conrad's smile turned into a frown. The rope had already turned his wrists red and raw, but the man didn't care at all. Instead, he gave his horse the spurs and made it speed up again, while Conrad could do nothing but run along. He cursed and looked up at the sun that would soon be setting.
Great plan,
he chastised himself. Apparently, that guy on the horse was one of those obstinate people. But if he really wanted to go on until after sundown, he had another thing coming. It wouldn't end well for either of them. The rope chafed his wrists as he stumbled along, already feeling the stinging pain in his side taking the last bit of his breath away. This man wanted to kill him, a part of him warned. If it went on like this, he wouldn't leave him any other choice than to lunge for the gun after all. He'd rather die from a bullet to the head than from being dragged behind a horse until the sun set. Yes. That would be a preferable end, Conrad told himself, and could feel his already racing heartbeat speeding up even more. All he needed to do was reach him, just for a second. He tried to run and felt the rough ground dripping at the bare sole of his foot. It didn't matter. The pain was gone. All he could feel right now was the adrenaline. He was just 3 steps behind the horse, 5 away from the man.
Just a bit more,
he told himself. In a few seconds, he would get his chance. He ran and groaned and suddenly saw the horse stop, and Conrad stumbled over his own feet and crashed to the dusty ground. Loud, mean laughter filled the air, but before he could do anything, 2 boots landed right next to his face. A strong hand grabbed hold of the rope and pulled him up until he could look at the man's grinning face. This was all a joke to him, Conrad thought, while he fought for air. His arms and legs were shaking. He could feel his lungs burning and his ribcage aching. He only glanced down at the man's gun once, and that look earned him a fist to the stomach that made him bowl over again. Groaning and wheezing, Conrad knelt on the ground while the man took the rope from the saddle and fastened it to a single old and dried-out tree, standing just a few steps to the side.
"I will kill you,"
Conrad mumbled in his thoughts, but made sure to keep his mouth shut. This wasn't his first rodeo, he told himself. He had gotten out of worse already. But right now, his whole body felt like it was on the brink of breaking down. Dust and sand were invading his lungs. He coughed and thought his ribs would shatter. The raw skin on his wrists was bleeding, and there was this dull ache growing in his foot. It took him 10 minutes to get up from the ground and slowly stagger to his feet. Meanwhile, the man had pulled a blanket from his horse and had put it down. He was now sitting comfortably there, eating something that looked like dried meat and drinking from a skin. Conrad stumbled around, then toward the tree, but as soon as he came too close, he heard a clicking sound that made his skin crawl. The man was still sitting there, only now he had his revolver in one hand and was aiming right at the tree. His message was clear. If Conrad tried to loosen a knot there, he would be shot in an instant. With a groan, he sank to his knees. This was not the time to think about escaping, he warned himself. The man was vigilant, experienced, and most of all, a sadist. He might even shoot at him just for the fun of it if he gave him half a reason. Conrad was shaking his head softly, then slowly got up from his knees and walked in a wide circle around the tree, until his feet found hard stone beneath them. At least he had been in luck in this regard. He plopped down and sprawled out to give his shaking legs a break. Slowly but steadily, his heart rate returned to normal. Air was getting into his lungs, and he only had to cough periodically. What still plagued him right now was the thirst he felt and the tension in the air. Conrad closed his eyes to rest for a bit. The sun was up for now. Would be for another hour or so at least. Until then, he could rest. He let his mind wander back to that dreadful night, to the moment he had crawled forward to the edge of the stone and had finally seen it. The moon had come out just in time as he slowly moved his body over the slab of rock beneath him, and in its light, he had seen how empty the area now truly was. Not a single person had remained beside him, but there had been a few hats strewn about. His whole body shivered at the memory, just like it had done back then. A whiff of rot had still hung in the air as he had looked down and saw something move at the edge of the stone. At first, he thought they were worms or maggots poking out from the sand, but that hadn't been the case. What he had seen were fingers. Grey and pale, they were sticking out from the soft earth, their dirty nails scratching at the rock. Back then, he had screamed and shot back, but the noise they made stayed with him still. He had spent the rest of the night sitting on that rock, thinking about what had happened. Well, the answer seemed clear. Maybe the fat fuck had bought a real map. What they had found there was some kind of burial ground or the like. And what they had done by digging here was getting cursed. Conrad felt another chill as he remembered. To his relief, The fingers and hands had disappeared as soon as the sun had risen. The camp had stayed empty. All those people who were present had been dragged into the ground as if it were nothing but water. Conrad had spent weeks getting back to civilization. Every evening he had looked for something that would shield him from the soft and sandy ground. And every night, those same hands had returned, reaching out for him. He hadn't found a way to break the curse. Yet as long as he stayed safe and off the sand, he could survive. Would survive. That had become his new life. One of hiding and enduring. Of course, it hadn't taken people long to realize that the expedition had disappeared. And after one person had seen him, rumors had started. Which was why and how he found himself in this situation right now. No survivors would have meant there had been some kind of calamity. One survivor normally means someone has betrayed the group. So they had put a bounty on his head. Officially, for questioning. Unofficially, to probably torture him. The first bounty hunter that had caught him had at least proved something else as well. People in his vicinity weren't safe from the curse either. Conrad opened his eyes just as the first cool breeze blew past him. The sun was setting, he saw immediately, from the deep and long shadows that were falling over the plains.
How about a sip of water?
Conrad called out and looked at the man still sitting on his blanket, smoking a cigarette. He stared back at him with a merciless smirk and seemed to ponder the question for a few moments longer. Conrad's throat felt like it was covered in sandpaper. He lifted his hands.
Come on, please. I'm not gonna make it through the night without water, you know?
The man was still looking at him with this unnerving smirk on his face. But just as Conrad was about to lower his hands, he suddenly saw the dark water skin flying through the air and toward him. Conrad did his best to catch it and drank from it ravenously. He needed his strength for the coming night, and the things that would try to get to him again. It was strange how quickly he had grown accustomed to it. From the first week where he had hardly slept more than a wink, to now, where he wanted to use the curse for his own benefit. The sun went lower, and he could smell the first whiff of rot in the air. Apparently, the man on the blanket noticed it as well, and shot him an angry glance. Conrad only now saw that he had built himself a tiny campfire and was about to light it. He grinned humorlessly.
That won't help you,
he wanted to say, but kept his mouth shut again. The curse would start up soon, and it was better not to provoke this angry guy beforehand. Conrad closed the water skin and threw it back at the man, who caught it without much glancing up. Smoke was rising from the few sticks he had stacked up, just before the first tiny flame made an appearance. The horse beside the man was starting to get restless. That was something else Conrad had noticed. All animals seemed to have a sixth sense for stuff like that. Only, once the curse started, they all got stiff and completely silent. He watched the man look over at his horse, then shake his head for a moment. Of course, Conrad could warn him, he knew, but that would only spell his own demise. So he sat back and took a deep breath. Just a bit more. A few minutes until the sun disappeared. I could already smell it in the air. That stench that always seemed to follow him. Conrad chuckled silently. He could feel the tension in the air, but made sure to not let the bounty hunter notice anything. His small fire was just getting a bit stronger, and the smell of smoke mixed with the stench of death surrounding them.
Please just stay there,
Conrad prayed in his mind. He was getting nervous. More than usual, he had to admit. Something was different today. He watched on and kept his bound wrists in front of his body, where the man could always see them. Maybe it was the way this guy looked at him now all the time, or how he seemed to be ready to shoot at the slightest provocation. Conrad took a deep breath and glanced at the sun that just now disappeared behind the horizon. It was coming. Now. He could feel his legs starting to shake.
Why so nervous?
The bounty hunter growled. Conrad just shook his head, but noticed the man putting a hand on the butt of his revolver. Shit. The tension was rising. How would a man like that react once he noticed that he was in danger? Maybe he would... Conrad got pulled out of his thoughts as a well-known sound suddenly reached his ears. One of the arms burrowing through the ground, fingernails scraping against stone. This time, the man heard it too. He looked around, confused, while his hand pulled out the gun. The horse beside him had fallen completely silent. Conrad watched the flames of the small campfire extinguish suddenly, and the world seemed to grow darker. He could hear the man cursing, and then saw the blanket he was sitting on moving. Like fingers were stroking it from below. They had noticed him. Conrad could hear a
"What the fuck?"
coming from the man as he jumped up to his feet and looked at the ground. It was shifting, moving. Conrad could see a hand appearing at the edge of the blanket. White, dead fingers grabbing hold of the corner. The man cursed again and jumped, just as the hand pulled at the cloth and dragged it down into the dirt in another split second. Now he was screaming, just like all the others. Conrad scooted back out of reflex as the first hand appeared on the stone close to his feet. It was trying to reach out to him, grab him as well. A flash of light illuminated the area as the man shot at the hand sticking out of the ground, followed by a bang. It was pointless. Conrad knew. Those things couldn't be killed like that. Only, as he looked up at the man, he could see the same realization in his eyes. They were wide now and full of fear.
"No!"
Conrad whispered, as he saw the barrel of the gun rising from being aimed at the ground, and now the muzzle pointing straight at him.
"You!"
A hoarse, gruff voice growled. He could see the dark gun aiming at his head as a hand coming out of the earth was grabbing the man's boot.
"No!"
he repeated, then heard a scream and saw the flash of light. Something hot whizzed past his head while an ice-cold pain flooded through his ear. The man was still shouting as he fell, two more hands grabbing him by his leg. Conrad felt blood trickling down his cheek and then his neck. The bullet had missed him, and he was up on his feet.
"Don't!"
he screamed, as he saw the man reaching out for anything to hold on to. His hand touched the rope just as his leg disappeared beneath the dirt. Conrad howled as he felt the rough cord cutting into his wrists, dragging him closer to the edge of the stone. The bounty hunter was looking up at him, terror in his eyes. He was holding onto the rope, trying to stop those dead arms from pulling him down beneath the ground. Conrad felt himself getting dragged along. The edge of the stone he had been sitting on was coming up, as was the hand already reaching over the side, clawing at the hard surface. It wanted him. They wanted him. "No!" he screamed again and pulled against the man's weight. He was down in the ground up to his hips already. Did he want to kill him as well? Conrad howled as the wounded sole of his right foot slid over the rock. Those dead fingers were already so close. "Let go!" he screamed at the man holding onto the rope. This guy really was intent on killing them both. Conrad had to bring his legs forward to push against the rope. His wrists were bleeding, as was the side of his face, blood trickling from his neck. He could see it, dripping onto the sand next to the edge of the stone, and the dead arm, now touching his shoe. The earth seemed to simply fall away where his blood had dropped. A hole was forming, the one he would be dragged into. Conrad screamed again, and as he looked down, could see something inside the hole. A face, dead and grinning, with pure white eyes staring up at him in greed. He howled and pulled back as another voice joined in his cry. It was the man, the bounty hunter. Dead arms were reaching up around his back, grabbing him by the shoulders and pulling him down. "Let go!" Conrad cried out, and for a single moment, their eyes met. In the fear and terror he saw there, he also noticed a kind of hate he had never seen before. The bounty hunter's fingers slipped off the rope, and with a last scream, he was pulled down into the earth. Suddenly, the rope slacked, and Conrad stumbled backward, out of reach of the dead hands still trying to get to him. His back hit the rough stone with a thud, and all the air shot out of his lungs in an instant. Stars were dancing in front of his eyes, while at the edge of his consciousness, he noticed now the hands reaching out from beneath the earth, trying to grab hold of the rope. Conrad pulled at it and watched them miss it by a hair. He felt drowsy and lightheaded and could smell his own blood. But if he passed out now, it would be the end for him. They would pull him under. The hands were still reaching out for the rope. That was all he could think about. He needed to hold on to the rope, keep it away from them. No, it wouldn't work. He could feel himself losing consciousness. The night was getting darker, even as the stars in front of his eyes multiplied. This wouldn't work. There was only one thing he could do. Conrad grabbed hold of his thumb just as he watched one of the hands curling a finger around the rope. They had noticed it as well. He screamed as he broke his own finger, then felt the pull of the rope still binding his wrists. Conrad was ripped forward, but the blood on his skin made the cord slippery. Another jerk as more hands found the rope and tried to drag him in. He pulled against it and felt a sharp pain as the rough cord scraped over his skin. With a snapping sound, the rope slipped off his wrists and disappeared beneath the sand. Conrad collapsed. They were still pulling at the rope until it broke from the tree. Exhausted, he could hear himself laughing while the dead hands were scraping against a stone, trying to find a way to get to him.
Not tonight,
he coughed as he held his injured hand and turned to his side.
not tonight.
The blood loss was making him drowsy. He could feel every single injury. His whole body seemed to be on fire. But he had survived another night. Conrad screamed and laughed and cried. One more day he had given himself. Just one more for all that pain. Sooner or later, he wouldn't be so lucky, he knew. One of these days, they would get to him. But not tonight. No. For now, he was still alive and free.